middle of nowhere, stuck in a place where no one ever goes, where other people refuse to live or travel. If you find yourself in the middle of nowhere, you may just experience terror of every variety. Enjoy these middle of nowhere stories. If you have your own scary experience, share it with us at darkstories.org so that I can narrate it. I'm looking for sightings or encounters with Wendigo, and I'm trying to find a new reason to live now that the Antlers film has been pushed back. Anyway, let's begin. Road Walk from GreatMovesEthan. Slugbug. Reynold hit me in the shoulder as hard as he could, causing me to swerve the car on the dark road. But luckily, there was no one else driving that night, or so it appeared for the last 100 miles. Crap, man, that's not funny. There's not even a bug on the road, dude. I got us back on the right side of the road and rubbed my shoulder. Then I gave him a quick but mean scowl. Yeah, I know, but I want to make sure you're not falling asleep. I saw you dozing off a minute ago. Scared the crap out of me. I don't want my brain implanted into some tree out here. Whatever, I said, not realizing that I probably did just doze off a second. We'd stayed up really late partying with our friend. It was his bachelor party. Things got a little too wild. But now we were halfway home on a 5-hour journey. It was dark out, and we were both tired out of our minds. Basically, yeah, maybe I did deserve that punch in the shoulder. Reynolds starts messing with the bags of chips we have in the back, a bunch of leftover road trip junk food. He snacks on a bag of Lay's potato chips, and then he goes quiet for a while. When I glance over maybe 10 minutes later, he's out cold. I rub my face a little bit, give myself a slap, trying to make sure I'm wide awake. The road I was driving on was quite hypnotic. Not a whole lot of winding turns or bends, and the trees to our left and right, they were colossal and menacing. But I tried to focus on what was ahead of me, which really wasn't much. Just straight, badly maintained road, miles upon miles from towns in any direction. Truly the middle of nowhere. Having creeped myself out from the thought of having to walk down this road at night if something happened to the car, I glanced down to the fuel gauge. We were 3/4 full, nothing to worry about. I looked back up, having only looked away for a split second, and slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. I ran right over into a pile of something in the middle of the road. I didn't have time to swerve around it either, but I tried. There was a loud pop coming from the back of the car. My panicked turn of the steering wheel caused us to fly into the ditch before coming to a sudden halt. Crap, I said, my heart feeling like it was going to beat out of my chest. Reynolds shot right up and looked at me, a bit of drool hanging out of his mouth. He noticed it and wiped it away quickly, at the same time asking me, "What in the hell, dude? What's going on? You didn't fall asleep, did you?" I rubbed my head, trying to console a worsening headache. Believe it or not, no. I think there was something in the road. Ran it over. Think it punctured the tires in the back. I undid my seatbelt and began to climb out of the car. Reynolds did the same. The cold night air hit me hard, as if it were a spirit passing right through me. I crossed my arms and held them tight, then began to walk to the back end of the car. Reynolds checked his side, and I did the same, lowering myself down to the back left tire. The thing was torn to shreds. It was far beyond the hope of getting it patched. The whole dang tire needed replaced. I sighed, and then I heard Reynolds cursing. "What in the world did you hit, dude? The tire practically exploded over here." I walked around to his side and took a look. He was right. The tire on the back right had also been obliterated. I have no idea what I hit. It was dark and happened really fast. Turning on the flashlight on my phone, I walked up out of the ditch and Reynolds followed. I aimed the light toward the road and followed traces of burnt rubber and what appeared to be these yellow-white shards. They were bones. As I followed these yellow-white particles, they grew larger until it led me to what appeared to be a very old carcass on the road. "Well then," I said. Reynolds spoke up. "That's the first time I've seen or heard of people's tires being blown out by a ribcage. I'm almost impressed, Ethan. But now we're stranded. I only have one spare tire, man. Here, let me call up Lane. We'll get someone out here to pick us up. It's gonna be several hours, though. What are we, like 3.5 hours out from either direction? Perfect." He began to dial a number, and I continued to scan the road around me. I found another carcass on the road, then another. In total, there were 7 different animal carcasses on the road, and these were larger creatures. Looked like deer. I felt more cold, more chilled than I did when I stepped out of the car. I motioned for Ethan to come back to the car with me. We had no other choice than to wait inside anyway. With the temperature being single digits, it was going to be a cold, long wait. While Ethan's car's heaters did work, they weren't the best. Back in the car, I put them on full blast, then turned off the headlights. The way we were angled, we might blind someone if they passed by. But if need be, we had plenty of time to signal them with the headlights. We'd be able to see them coming for a while. Reynolds put the phone back in his pocket and then let me know. "All right, Lane's sending his wife, Alyssa. He's already been called to work, this early in the freaking morning, can you believe it? So, it's gonna be a couple of hours." "Gotcha," I said, and laid back in the seat, reclining it as far as it would go. "By the way, did you see just how many carcasses were in the road?" I asked him. "Huh? What do you mean?" "There's like 7 dead deer out there. I mean, do they have wolves up in these woods?" "Nah, not as far as I can remember," he answered. "Nah, before I moved down with you, the worst we got were coyotes, and they're tiny little things compared to dogs. For the most part, they're mangy, skinny little opportunists. I don't think that's what killed those deer, but they're probably getting ready to come up here and chew on the remains." "Gross," I said. "Well, maybe it was a semi, ran over a whole family of deer," I suggested. "Yeah, only thing that makes sense," Reynolds agreed. Then he reclined too, reaching for yet another bag of Lay's. "Hey, grab me a bag of Cheetos while you're at it." "Flaming hot?" "Do you even have to ask?" I said. He tossed the bag to me. For the next hour or so, we laid there, just looking out the window. With the headlights off, we could see the sky pretty well, and the stars were bright out in these parts. Would have been a beautiful night had we not found ourselves in this predicament. And I have to admit, the thought of those carcasses on the road, they did spook me a bit. They didn't look like they'd been run over. They looked like they'd been torn open, eaten. I shook my head and got that off my mind. Focusing on that right now would only make the situation more unbearable. So I turned on the radio, then lowered the volume just enough to where the music was subtle. "It's kinda like we're camping, huh?" Reynolds wondered aloud. "Pretty much. Wish we had some s'mores instead of chips, though. And you ate all the Slim Jims on the way up here." "Hey, I'm a carnivore. Can't help it," he smiled. But then his face went straight. "Hey, he scratched his temple, giving some thought into what he was about to say. "Do you happen to remember going camping? Me, you, and Lane out in the woods? It was our freshman year." My stomach sank a bit. It was weird that he was asking me if I remembered it. How could I forget that? So I simply nodded. I turned away to face the stars again. I think he was waiting for a reply, so I eventually gave him one. That's something pretty difficult to forget. "So, do you still believe, Lane?" He dug into the bag of chips he had in his hand, pulled out the biggest one he could find and chomped down hard on it, then set up to down a swig of water. His question made me wonder. We were kids, but I know Lane wasn't faking it. I know what I saw on his leg. I answered. He seemed satisfied. A little smirk grew on the side of his face. That's what I thought you'd say. And if you believe him, I believe him too. Man, some weird stuff goes on in the woods. He tossed his now empty bag of chips in the back seat, our trash pile basically, then laid back again. I had been trying to keep myself from being more creeped out, but then he had to bring up that memory. Way back when we were freshmen in high school, we played sick on a Friday so that we could have a 3-day weekend. We had made plans to go camping in these very woods. Just me, Lane, and Reynold. Lifelong best friends, and best friends still, even though we lived so far away from each other. Well, at least to us it felt far. What happened out there? It was the first thing that happened to me that had me question reality. That night we all slept in the same tent, but Reynold woke me up, and Lane was gone. The moment we stepped out of the tent, Lane, either unconscious or still sleeping somehow, was being dragged away. I screamed in time to cause whatever was dragging him to release him and run off. I was also out of the tent first before Reynold, so I was the only one that saw what had taken Lane. But it's something that I tried hard to convince myself I simply saw wrong. At first I told myself it was some psycho in the woods that tried to kidnap our friend, but then I decided it was simply Lane sleepwalking. When Lane explained what happened to us, he could only recall the last few seconds before that thing let go and took off. Said that whatever it was, it didn't have the right amount of fingers, and that its skin was slimy yet smooth. He even showed us a spot on his leg. It was swelling up and red and covered in some sort of thin mucus. Now, Reynold had never been the type of guy to be able to take things calmly. He was known to panic first, then run away before asking any questions. So he threw a tantrum of denial right then, saying that Lane had did it to himself, that it wasn't cool, that he wanted to leave now. While we all agreed that we wanted to leave, I looked at Reynold and I told him I believe him, that I believed Lane. Reynold didn't like this. The guy actually started to cry. He trusted me a lot, and having me say that, it was like I was confirming that he should be afraid. We left those woods as quickly as we could that night, and we never went back for another camping trip. So yeah, I believe what Lane said. I just didn't want to believe what I saw dragging him away. And I still hadn't told Reynold or Lane what I think I saw. A steady, light rain began to fall outside. It landed and flowed down the windshield, even more mesmerizing than the road had been when I was driving before. I was dozing off again, until Reynold shook me. What? I said. Dude, it's raining. He seemed a little freaked out. Yeah? So? He pointed toward the dashboard. Look at the temperature gauge. Look at the temperature on your phone. I did as he asked. The screen on the dash said 8 degrees, and my phone read 7. Huh. Reynold went on. Shouldn't the rain be freezing? Freezing on the ground, at least? Shouldn't it be snow or sleet or something? I shook my head. Man, you're just freaking out because we're stuck out here. You're making something out of nothing. No, look! Look out the window, look at the ground. I rolled my eyes and looked out the window. The rain formed little puddles in the holes in the pavement, and little streams in the cracks. I must have sat there for a few minutes looking at the water, but he was right. It never froze. And then the temperature began to drop, rapidly. According to my phone, it dropped another 15 degrees and was now well below 0. I kept glancing from my phone to the outside, and the rain didn't freeze. It refused to, but I refused to make anything more of it. I looked at Reynold and said, "We aren't scientists. I'm sure there's something going on, maybe with the road or with the weather, that's just keeping this water from freezing." Then Reynold looked like he had an idea. He grabbed his bottle of water that was in the cup holder, opened his door, letting in quite the chill. Then he began to pour some of the water on the ground. "What are you doing, Reynold?" I said. "We'll just see if my water freezes. Maybe we'll know something then." "So you're wasting our drinking water for a science experiment?" He looked at me with a finger over his mouth. "Just shush," he said. I leaned over towards him, and I looked out the door. I wanted to see this in action. Of course it wasn't going to freeze. If the rain wasn't freezing, his water wasn't going to freeze. I watched the water hit the ground, mix a little bit in the grass with the rain. Before, over the next minute or so, clumps of ice formed where the water had been poured, but the rain around it remained liquid. "What the hell?" I said. Then Reynolds said what I think we were both thinking. "I don't think that's rain, Ethan." He put the cap back on his water bottle, then closed the door. He made sure to lock it too. "So it's just some dirty rainwater. Doesn't freeze because all the crap in it, I guess." Reynolds looked at me and said, "Sure, let's go with that. I'm just gonna try to get some sleep." I nodded, and he laid back, facing away from me. I sat back in my seat as well, and it didn't take long to finally fall asleep. I'm awakened when the sound of thunder crashes outside. Reynolds is still sleeping, so I don't wake him. I don't feel tired enough to go back to sleep though, oddly enough. We'd only been sleeping for a couple of hours. I stayed awake, watching the rain and now the lightning outside. Lightning that had a weird green tint to it, made everything seem more ominous than it really was. I glanced at the ground outside and, once again, the rainwater was still liquid. No ice on the ground. As I lay there, I began to hear a sound within the rain, a sound I thought was wind at first, howling through the trees. But as it got louder, closer, it stopped sounding like wind and sounded more like crying, like the tormented cry of someone mourning someone close to them. It was coming from the left side of the road, from the woods, growing louder by the second. With a big green flash of lightning in the sky, the road in front of us and the edges of the woods to our sides are brightly lit for a couple of seconds. Within that brief window, I see a figure in the road. A very tall figure. A very familiar figure. Who is that? Reynolds had awakened. I looked over to him. He was rubbing his eyes and looking in the direction of the figure too. But just like me, he became quiet and started to stare. The figure must have been 9 feet tall, maybe more. It looked like we could stack 2 of this car on top of each other, and that thing would still be taller. It appeared to be looking up towards the sky. Lightning kept flashing in and out, revealing to us this thing for plenty of time. This tall thing with a skinny torso and thin, long limbs, but a head that was bulbous, like a baby's, except far larger than that. But I could not find its eyes, a face at all, really, and I was left wondering if it was facing away from us or towards us. Then, more figures like that one, but at different heights and different proportions of bulbous head, began to walk out of the left side of the woods, slowly, like slow motion slow, crossing over the road and onto our side. The moaning sound, the cry, it seemed to be coming from each and every one of them. If I didn't know any better, I'd say they sounded sad. We stayed quiet and hunkered down in the car, getting as low as we could to still watch the things outside, but lowering our chances of being seen. I was glad then that I kept the headlights off. I looked at Reynold. He was shaking a bit. He started to turn around, wanting to look out the back window. When he did, his eyes grew wide and his shaking intensified. He looked at me, then looked ahead, as if to say without a word that I need to see this. I followed his gaze and looked out the back window as well. Those things were all over the road, behind us and ahead of us, but the ones behind us, a couple of them had crouched toward the ground and were picking at the bones and meat of the dead deer. Each one that stopped at a deer carcass would only take a few bites before getting back up and walking in that physically impossible slow-mo walk. In silence, in fear, in terror, we must have watched 100 of these things cross the road before it finally stopped. And only when the last centimeter of flesh of one of those things disappeared beyond the trees did the wind and rain and lightning suddenly stop. The rain all over the road and ground, it didn't freeze or stay, but seemed to fade, evaporate. Before long, we were left in the exact same position we had been. A dry, dark road, quiet and alone. But it took longer for the crying moan to stop. We didn't even dare sit up in our seats until that sound faded. And when we did sit up, we simply looked at each other and tried to stutter out the first words. What? Reynold tried to speak, but he could not find the words. But I did have something to say. Reynold, those things, I've seen one of them before. You're not going to believe me, I know you're not, but one of those things tried to drag away Lane. His eyes narrowed. Did he disbelieve me? Or was he mad, angry that I hadn't told him this yet? Way back when we were camping, what we just talked about, I never told you guys, didn't know if I even should, but I saw what was dragging him away. He wasn't sleepwalking, he wasn't taken by a person. I was never sure of what I saw until now. But it was the exact same height, same shape as one of those things. I'm sure of it now. I collapsed into the car seat, and I just waited. Reynold remained quiet. Another hour of this silence, of this terror of wondering if they'd turn around and come back to cross the road again before Alyssa's car finally pulled up. The two of us put on fake faces, told her we were happy to see her, and thanked her for picking us up. But when she asked if we were okay, beyond just the slight accident in the ditch, we feigned ignorance, not sure what she was talking about. Reynold eventually accepted my apology for holding my secret for so long. We made it back to society okay, and we keep this story to ourselves. I'm not sure if we should tell Lane this, but maybe he does have the right to know. That night was really a weird one. And still, I have no idea what those things were, or whether or not they meant us harm. I'm just glad that they didn't see us. Family Cabin from Mike B. My family has a cabin in northern Alberta on a beautiful lake called Island Lake. It is pretty much the middle of nowhere. I was 18 years old. The family cabin had recently been reconstructed into a full-fledged house. The cabin was still under construction and was being painted at the time. My dad decided to take up hunting for the weekend. He invited both me and my best friend. Out at the cabin, my passion had always been building fires and chopping wood. One night on one of these weekends, I decided around midnight to go down the stairs descending to the beach and build a fire in the fire pit. My dad and my friend were both asleep at the time, so I decided to just go about doing my thing. Suddenly, I began to hear a crackling in the bushes on the neighbor's property. Our neighbors had a very dense forest connecting to a local campground on their property. I brushed it off as a raccoon or something and continued about making the fire. When I finally got it going, I stopped to look at the stars, but I was interrupted when I heard a growl coming from the bushes. I turned and I saw a pair of eyes staring right back at me. I could not make out what they belonged to, so slowly I went into the shed to grab a flashlight. As I did so, I suddenly heard a bang on the side of the shed. I looked up the window of the shed, hoping to catch a glimpse of what did that. But there I saw the eyes again. A feeling of dread welled up in me. I'd left the shed door open. I could hear what sounded like claws dragging along the side of the shed. This thing sounded plenty big, and I did not want it in the shed with me. After all, if I could see its eyes in the window, it had to have been at least 7 feet tall. Just when I thought this thing was going to come inside and end me, my father stepped out onto the deck and turned on the bright floodlights facing down to the beach. "Mike," he called out. "You down there, boy?" The scratching stopped, and I heard the creature run off into the bushes as if scared by the light. Quickly, without even putting out the fire, I ran upstairs to the cabin and I rushed inside as fast as I could. I only once briefly stopped to look to the bush by the neighbor's cabin. I saw it in the nick of time, a figure fading away into the undergrowth. It was big. It was about 7 feet tall. I went inside and locked everything down, but I never saw that thing again. Still, when I find myself sitting by the fire at night, I can't help but feel I'm being watched. Who knows when the creature will show up again, or if it ever left. Maybe it's always close by, watching someone from the bushes. Keep an eye out for any dogs you might have, and keep your small children close. Outdoor Story from Jacob L. I go to my grandpa's every year to fish. My grandpa is used to telling a specific story when we're out. The story of the so-called Owl Man, or the Cheney Creek creature. He had always made these stories up. I was about 13 at the time, and I still had a wild imagination. I believed him for a while, but what happened that night changed everything. We had just got done with supper and we went to start a fire. We grabbed the logs and began to douse the logs in lighter fluid. As I turned to grab the lighter, I heard a branch snap. I turn and look and can't see anything in the darkness, so I continue to light the fire until I spotted a dark figure sort of crawling into the water. I don't say anything. I don't want to spook my younger brother, who was sitting in a chair behind me. My grandpa then went inside to grab some marshmallows, and everyone else follows. They leave me to watch the fire and tell me not to do anything stupid. I nod, laughing a little bit. While they're inside, I sit, now watching the creek. I hear water splashing in the direction of the creek. A chill runs up and down my spine. I feel as if I'm being watched. Looking around, I find a tall, dark figure standing far away by the creek, so I can't get a lot of detail. But then I watch it walk right back into the lake. As it did so, I heard a sound similar to chains rattling. As it crawls back into the water, it stares at me with bright yellow eyes and screeches. That screech was so awful, I covered my ears. I go to get my pellet gun, thinking it could protect me. but it acted more like a security blanket. I aimed it at the creek, kept my eye on the scope, and watched for every single movement I could. But the thing doesn't come back up. I'll never forget what happened that day, and I can still hear the rattling of chains in my head. It's so vivid. I don't ever want to hear it for real again. I'm not entirely sure how middle of nowhere the next two stories are, but I did my best to go off of some hunches, as I think they're pretty cool stories. The first takes place in West Virginia, which is quite rural, and the second takes place in Mexico, 5 hours from the airport. Just wanted to let you know I'm just guessing on these, but I think you'll enjoy the stories nonetheless. The Familiar Visits at Night, from BleakMountain. This happened in our former home, an old house way out in West Virginia that housed many bad memories for my family and I. We live in another state now. We're the only ones who have ever lived in that house. It was built and never sold until my family and I bought it. I've always thought that spirits and entities were attracted to negative emotions and outbursts, which happened a lot in my old house. In addition, my father was going through hard times at the time, with his job, money, the usual. The old house is a one-story place with a basement. It has 3 bedrooms. One of the bedrooms was the master bedroom, and they gave that to my oldest sister. That's because my 2 teenage sisters needed their own rooms, as did I when I grew older. My parents used to sleep in the master bedroom for a while, but since they needed to give it to my sister, they separated a part of the basement off and made it into their bedroom. One night, my mother was lying beside my father in their bed when she noticed a mist hovering over my father, who was fast asleep. My mother thought it was her mother, but our dog started barking, and she knew something wasn't right. However, she thought it'd be best not to wake up her husband and scare him. The next night, however, she was fast asleep, and my father was awakened. My sisters and I would sometimes come down to my parents' room at night to talk to them because we were scared. When my father awoke this night, he noticed what he thought was my youngest sister standing in the doorway. The figure was dressed in white and had blonde hair. My sisters had blonde hair too. "You okay, sweetie?" he said, tired and irritated to be woke up. The figure, whom he thought was my sister until now, turned its head in confusion, much like a dog would. My father's face turned quickly from tiredness to terror, his eyes wide open and the hairs on his arms sticking up. He realized the figure did not know he could see it. That is why it looked confused. He also realized it wasn't my youngest sister, for all the lights were off, and when she came down to the basement, she was too scared to not have them on, and would turn on as many lights as she could. Then its face began changing, from my youngest sister's face to my grandmother's, then to my aunt's. My father began yelling loudly to my mother, "Turn on the light!" He kept trying to wake her up. She finally did and turned on the light as he asked. She asked what was wrong. He wouldn't talk to her for about half an hour, though. When he finally told her, she was shocked and admitted what she saw the other night. My dad said that the figure he saw dispersed into a mist after my mom awakened. My parents thought it could possibly be my mother's mom's spirit, as my youngest sister did look like her. Today, however, I think my dad believes it was a familiar, though my mother is convinced it was malevolent. If you don't know, a familiar is an entity who disguises itself as a loved one or someone you know. I've heard of them asking to come into someone's house or luring someone towards them, disguised as someone they love. But I think this one was invited into our home by means of negative emotion and outburst. I believed it to have been a demon in the form of someone we know. We have since blessed the house in the name of the Lord, and there have not been too many odd occurrences afterwards. Just beware. If you live among negative energy and emotion, you might just invite something in. Something harmful, something you weren't expecting. The Crying Woman, from Jessica D. I'm sure we've all heard the legend of La Llorona, the Crying Woman, and I can't say for sure if what I experienced here was indeed a La Llorona encounter, but it was still terrifying. This story takes place in 2017, when I was on vacation in Mexico, visiting my in-laws. It was the first time I'd be meeting them in person, as my husband and I were living in California with our 3 children. I should mention that I'm a white, bilingual female, and this visit was a total surprise to all but one of my in-laws. My older daughters, who are twins, chose not to travel with me, mostly because my husband is their stepfather, and they really don't have contact with his side of the family. They don't speak Spanish, and my in-laws do not speak English. It was just me and our then 2-year-old daughter, who is his only blood-related child, traveling to visit her paternal grandparents, while my husband stayed in the States working, making sure the bills and rent were paid for the 2 months we'd be gone. It was a very exciting adventure. It would be both of our first time meeting my husband's parents, as well as our first time in Mexico. We were met at the airport by one of my sister-in-laws, the only one who knew we were coming, and her husband, who drove us from the airport to their home some 5 hours away. My husband and I have a house on the same property as his parents that we are still currently building onto, so at the time of my visit, the second story was still missing the roof, among other things. My daughter, who we'll call Ivy, and I stayed in the room downstairs that is already completed, but at night, I would frequently sneak upstairs when my daughter was asleep, just to stare at the beautiful night sky. Although the days were hot and humid, at night the whole atmosphere changed, and it's fresh and cool, and it often rained, even in the summer months. On nights when it doesn't rain, you can still see spectacular lightning storms in the distance, lighting up the night sky. One night, however, I saw something that will forever chill me to the bone. I'd only been staying there a few days when, late at night, I woke up to use the bathroom and get a drink of water. It was then that I heard a faint cry. Thinking it may have been my mother-in-law, I snuck through the doorway that separated our 2 houses as they connected. I stood outside of her room listening for crying, but when I heard it again, I realized it wasn't coming from her room. It wasn't coming from the house at all. Instead, the faint sound of a woman crying was coming from outside and seemed to be getting closer. I rushed, quietly but quickly, back to my house, creeping up the stairs to look through one of the still uncovered windows of what will soon be my room. Like I said, the house was still under construction, so aside from not having a roof, the windows were basically just huge rectangular holes in the brick wall, without any kind of bars or glass to cover them. As I crept to the window closest to me, where I could get the best vantage point, I peered out to the street, where I saw something that caused me to freeze in place, and goosebumps popped up all over my body. Walking very slowly down the street was a woman dressed in a long black dress. I say she was walking, but the truth is she appeared to be in fact floating. I could not see her dress move at all as she made her way down the deserted main road. Now this caught me as extremely unusual. She was alone in the dark at 3:30 a.m. That is not safe, especially not in Mexico. As I continued to watch her gently glide down the street, I soon saw her stop in place right in front of the entrance to the property, and when she stopped, so did the crying. I watched in horror as ever so slowly, she turned and seemed to be looking directly at me. It was almost as if she knew I was watching her, and even more terrifying, she seemed to know where I was. A chill ran down my spine, my skin covered with goosebumps. I quickly ducked below the window. My blood felt as if it had turned to ice, and I was too scared to stand up, afraid that I'd find her approaching our home. Thankfully, though, when I did get up, about 30 seconds after crouching down, she was gone. There was no trace of her at all on the street, and there was no way that she could have moved out of my line of sight that quickly. I had a bird's eye view almost, and would have seen her running down the street in either direction. And then I thought, what if she had snuck onto the property while I wasn't looking? What if she was looking for a way in? On the road, there were some lamps, but once on our property, she would have the complete cover of darkness, rendering her virtually invisible, and that thought chilled me. I rushed back downstairs to make sure that all the heavy metal doors were all securely locked in both houses. After assuring myself that the place was locked up tight, I started making my way back to my room. But before I could get there, my daughter began to cry and scream for me. I ran back to my room, no longer caring how much noise I made. But when I entered the room, it was empty, aside from my 2-year-old sitting up in the middle of the bed. Even through the darkness of the room and the mesh of the mosquito net around her bed, I could see the terror on her face as she pointed to the window that looked out to the back door of our home. I rushed to the back door and illuminated the backyard with my cell phone, trying to see something, anything that might be lurking in the dark. The night was completely silent, except for the buzz of the mosquitoes and the chirping of the crickets. Before going back to bed, I again checked all the doors and windows on the ground floor, this time with Ivy in my arms. Again, everything was locked and secured, so I took Ivy back to bed. Within 30 minutes, we were both fast asleep. I awoke a few hours later to find the sun up, and something I found to be completely impossible. The back door to my house was wide open. The same door that Ivy had been pointing to in fear only a few hours ago. But I'd made sure it was closed and locked it before lying down to sleep. And had anyone in the house opened it, I would have been awakened by the distinct screeching and grinding of the metal lock sliding open. So, did the crying woman find a way inside? Thanks so much for joining us in today's episode. I hope you enjoyed the stories. There are more coming up soon, so if you want yours narrated, don't forget to send your scary experiences at darkstories.org. You can send in any creepy and allegedly true scary experience you've had, but we are especially looking for Wendigo encounters at the moment. If you want to support the show, check the links in the description. And until next time, here are the credits to my amazing patrons. Remember, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.